Hello. In this video, I want to continue our discussion of cost of capital by talking about how it is that you can estimate the cost of equity for your project. Um, so let's start with what we know. You've already modeled out the expected future cash flows that an investor is entitled to, so that's the operating cash flows given your project pro formas. You know how to solve for the present value of those cash flows given some weighted average of cost of capital. So you've already done that. And you've estimated the amount of outside capital you intend to contribute to the business. That's your capital contributions. And this amount must come from some combination of debt and equity. And you know your federal tax rate. So you will need to negotiate with outside parties normally, but in our case in class it'll be with me, an amount of money that you'll raise from a debt investor and the before tax interest rate that you'll have to pay that investor for that debt. And then you'll negotiate an amount of money you'll raise from an equity investor and what share percentage of the business you would wish that you would give up in return for that money. And so unlike with debt where you're saying, oh, I'll pay you 5% of whatever I borrowed as in return for the debt. For the equity, you're saying, oh, you'll give me this much money in return for that. You'll be entitled to, X percent, 40% of whatever the cash flows from the business are. Does not mean that they have to be distributed, but at some immediately, but at some point when cash flows are distributed, that's what they're entitled to. And so it's a different concept. That percentage share, to be clear, that is not the cost of capital, but you need it in order to estimate the cost, or the cost of equity, sorry. You need that percentage share to estimate the cost of equity. So with that information, you can clearly then estimate the proportion of funding that comes from debt versus equity. And so you have your weightings, what percentage debt, what percentage equity. You can calculate your after-tax cost of debt because it's just the before tax times 1 minus the tax rate. That means that if you assumed some cost of equity, so you just put in some assumed number, you could calculate out what your weighted average cost of equity could be. And again, that's just the amount coming from debt, right? The percentage of capital coming from debt times the after-tax cost of debt, plus the percentage coming from equity times what your assumed cost of equity is here. And once you had that weighted average cost, you could plug that in where we just put in a plugged in number and calculate the present value of your business given that weighted average cost of capital. If you knew that and you knew that, say you gave up 40% of your business in return for this equity, you could figure out what 40% of your business is worth, and you can compare that to the amount you received to see whether maybe you felt like you gave up too much or too little. Well, in our case, since we're just using an assumed cost of equity, it's not about whether you gave up too much or too little. You gave up what you gave up, all right? And so if we were to think about this, what you gave up should be equal to what you got in return. So if I gave up 40% of the business in return for $400,000, then that would imply that the business is worth $1 million because 40% of $1 million is 400,000. And so that has an implication that there must be some cost of equity that goes with that. And so if we just start adjusting the assumed cost of equity up or down, we can keep moving it around until we get to the point that the present value of the cash flows, so the value of the business, right, times whatever share I gave up, so let's say 40%, is equal to the amount of equity that I received. And once I've done that, whatever the assumed cost of equity that I have in that cell, once I've done that adjusting, that is my implied cost of equity. That is effectively how much I gave up in terms of return on equity to an investor based on my assumptions. I gave up that much of a return on equity in order to get this cash. So that's useful for me because then I can start kind of putting things like so what share should they be getting into the model, and kind of working through this process, and trying to get to what I think is a reasonable cost of capital or somewhere in between that. So what you're gonna, the main thing you're gonna learn through this process is that you're not negotiating explicitly the cost of equity. You're negotiating the share of the business that you're going to give up. And as you guys negotiate that, you're going to want to say, oh, if they're willing to take a 25% share, that implies this kind of a cost of equity, and does that seem fair to me or reasonable to me? What I'm going to do now is kind of break out of this process and go through that in the spreadsheet with you, so you can see how you might put this together. So I am not starting, you can see I'm not starting with the spreadsheet that is got all the sensitivity analysis and risk analysis in it. I'm jumping back to the one where we just have the present value of the operating cash flows. And that's the benefit. You guys should be keeping different versions of these things, but I'm jumping back to that version just because it's a little bit easier for me to work with. Doesn't mean you can't do it with the other version, but this is easier. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try and capture some of the information that we know above, and some of the assumptions that we have, and then I will walk through kind of the process I described. So let's see, the total financing dollars that we need to raise, that's just equal to the capital contributions. It's just a formula. Financing dollars from debt, and I'm going to plug in a number. I'm going to plug in $1 million, I think. Let's see, let me go do the format painter and make sure it comes out. Okay, so that's an assumption, $1 million. All right, so the debt financing weight. So what proportion of the total amount of financing comes from debt? That's just equal to the debt amount divided by the total amount of financing. So about 71.4%, something like that. Okay, and then the before tax cost of the debt. So this is whatever I negotiated with my investor, what percentage interest they said. So let's just say 9%. Okay, and so again, we'll go through a negotiation. You'll have this number. You always do the debt first and then the equity. So you'll have this number, but you do need to negotiate it. But once you'll have that number, and then the after tax. Well, let's just say what's the tax rate. I'm just going to go get that from above. I don't know if you remember, but it's up here somewhere. Let's see, federal tax rate's kind of what I'm looking for. Here we go, federal income tax rate. So I'm just grabbing it. So the after tax cost of debt, and that is equal to 1 minus, I'll put that in parentheses, 1 minus the tax rate times the cost of debt. Okay, so that's about 5.85% it looks like. And again, I'm not highlighting those because we're just calculating those, all right? So that's all of the debt stuff. And then let's do, kind of borrow these two labels, makes it easier for me. So financing dollars from equity. All right, and I don't need to plug this in. It's just equal to whatever my total is less whatever I'm going to receive from debt. So it has to be. And the equity financing weight, you can either do what I'm going to do, which is to just calculate that ratio again, or you can take 1 minus the debt percent, because these two percentages have to add up to 1. But I'm just going to do 400 divided by 1.4 million. If you were to add this percent and the debt financing weight percent together, they should equal 1. And I think if you did the math in your head, you'd say that works. All right, and now here's kind of the tricky part of this, the first tricky part. We're going to go cost of equity. And I know we don't know what that is yet, right? I'm just going to put in a percentage, right? And the reason is because we're going to solve for this number, but we're going to solve for it a particular way. But bottom line is that that's, for now, that's just an assumption that we have. All right, so let's see, I'm going to shade it a little bit differently so we can keep track of that, okay? Now, let's just go down here and do the weighted average cost of capital. All right, it's just the weight of the debt times the after-tax cost of the debt plus the weight of the equity times the cost of the equity. So my WACC at this point comes out to somewhere around a little less than 10%, 9.89%. Now, we already had a weighted average cost of capital up here. We used it right here to calculate out our present value, this present value before. So all we're going to do is, instead of having a plug number there, we're going to set this now equal to the WACC that we've calculated here. All right, and since we did that, I'm going to expand that out a little bit, but I'm also going to remove the highlight here because it's no longer, this cell is now formula driven. It's not the assumption. This is also formula driven. So far we've just made these three assumptions and gotten to a WACC. Well, that's not enough for us to get where we want to do. Now what we want to do is we want to say, okay, what's the present value of the business given this WACC, right? And we've already used the formula to solve for that, so we're just going to go grab that, okay? And I want to make sure, yeah, okay, so all of those are changing, good. So the present value of the business is almost $3 million with that WACC. And now we've got one other thing, share of business given up for equity. All right, and we might say, oh, I gave up 30% of the business in return for that, and that's an assumption. All right, but you're going to negotiate that. So right now I'm just sticking in as a value, but in the negotiation you would say, how much of the business do you want in return for your $400,000? And I, as the investor, might say, I would like a 30% share. So you would stick that in here, all right? And so what does that imply? That implies present value of the share of the business is simply whatever the total is times 30%, right? And so what that says is that based on your assumptions and based on your debt financing and everything else, I'm offering to give you $400,000, and in return, you're going to give me something that we think is worth $880,000. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like a great deal to me. It will be what it will be, obviously, but we don't know whether it's really $880,000 because we don't really know what the right cost of equity is. At the end of the day, we're not going to solve for, we're not going to negotiate, oh, I think that cost of equity is too high, I want to lower it to something lower. We're going to do that implicitly by lowering the share until we get a cost of equity that makes sense for us. I'll show you how we do that again. Okay, so now I just want to do this, let's just say the share of the business less the equity contribution. All right, and so that is just the share of the business is the 880,000 minus the 40,000, and ideally I'd like those to be zero. This really calculates out when it's positive and says this is assuming that it really was at a 20% cost of equity. You gave up way more than you should have, right? You gave up $481,000 more than what you got in return. Now, obviously, what I could do is I could say, well, the 30% is what it is, so that would imply a higher cost of equity. So I'll go up to cost of equity and just raise it up to 30%. And what that does is it moves the weighted average cost of capital, and that lowers the present value of the business, and so starts to bring that 30% value down, right? 30% is now 30% to 1.7 million instead of almost 3 million, and so total is 536 versus the 4. We're still about 136,000 off, so I might say 35%. And that gets a little bit closer, but quite frankly, it's still a little bit high, so let's try 36%, right? Well, we could keep playing around doing this, and you can hunt and pack, right? Another simple way of doing this is in Excel. There is a what's called a goal seek. So you go under the data tab, you go what if analysis, and it's called goal seek. And what this does is it says set a cell, and I'm going to have it set this differences cell to a value. I'm going to have it set it to 0, and so it's going to set that differences value to 0 by changing my cost of equity. All right, so I hit it, hits go, and what it did is the same thing I was doing, sort of hunting and pecking, if you will. I'm going to expand out the number of decimal places on the cost of equity. But it instead of me going through and trying different values in order to get those two to where they're equal, it just comes back and says, oh, based on these assumptions, it's equal when the cost of equity is 36.32%. Now, here's the rub on that. So 36.32% to me sounds like a really expensive cost of equity. But once again, you cannot go back to the investor and say, I want the cost of equity to be 25%. You go back to them instead and you say, that share of 30% of the business implies a cost of equity that's just too high. And so you have to propose a different share. All right. Now, one of the things that you could do is maybe you could target a share. Right. So let's just use our goal seek again. Let's go here and say data, what if analysis, goal seek. And I want to set cell cost of equity. Let's say that I think 20% is a fair, so 0.20 is a fair cost of equity. And I'm going to do that by changing the share of the business I give up. Sorry, it won't do that. I apologize. I forgot. It won't do that because it has to be a formula in here, and I guess it's not going to do that way. Anyway, I'm not sure what I did there, but bottom line is that it's not going to let me do that. Anyway, so what I can do instead is just start moving down this share. Let's make the share 20% and redo our what if analysis, our goal seek analysis. So now again, we're going to set this difference to be equal to 0 by changing the cost of equity cell. So you can see it solved it down to about a 27% cost of equity if we give up 20%. Maybe I want to move that share down to 15%. We'll do our what if analysis, goal seek, change the difference. Right, we want the cell value, we want to set it to 0 by changing the cost of equity again. Okay. So if I give up a 15% share of the company in return for $400,000, then based on my calculations, that would imply about a 22% return on equity to the investor, 22% cost equity to me. That seems a lot more reasonable. It also implies a weighted average cost of capital of 10.42%, which is kind of in line with where I think I hoped I would be. So that's how you would use this. Again, we will talk about this more in the negotiation discussions, but I did want to walk through this with you so you could see how this calculation goes. As always, any questions that you have, you can bring those to class, and I will answer them there.